girls club and started following St. Anthony's because it was just an exciting brand of basketball. It was something we never experienced before. But we were getting into the travel team program at that time in the very beginning. And the next era I remember was Kenny Wilson.
Well, maybe you want to go 1 year back to David Rivers.
Oh, well, okay, let's do that because tell us about the David Rivers. David Rivers was, I know, in the 25, 30 years we've been friends, it's one of your most special.
Yeah,
I know
David
that.
probably. David was probably the most exciting player to ever play at the school, and I'll never forget. I got a phone call in the summer before it would have been his freshman year, and one of his sisters, one of 14 children, one of his sisters called me and said that the family had gotten together and they decided that they wanted him to go to St. Anthony's. And I just didn't remember him from grammar school that year.
Right.
How I didn't remember him, I have no idea because he was such a good player. But I remember saying to them, well, we're going away to basketball camp in about 2 weeks. Here's a telephone number. Make this call if you want to also send him to camp. And we had a bus going up to camp, so they obviously had made the call, and he went to camp. I got up to camp, and it was an All-American from St. John's named Danny Waddleton. He was a very good player, and Dan was coaching at the time. I walked into the gym, and I said, Danny, how's everything? He goes, wait till you see this kid play over here. Wait till you see this kid handle the ball. And Danny was used to tossing superlatives around quite a bit, so I wanted to see for myself. So I threw my bag in the room, went into the gym. This is 5 minutes after we get to the facility up at the Sopus facility up in Poughkeepsie. And we walk in the gym, and I see this whirling dervish handling the basketball, dribbling skills, unbelievable dribbling skills. So I watch him play a little bit, and it's incredible what I'm looking at. And then I called him over, and I said, where are you from? He said, I'm from Jersey City. I said, how old are you? He said, I'm going to be a freshman. And I said, where are you going to high school? He goes, my sister called you last week. I'm David Rivers. I'm going to St. Anthony's. I can't remember the rest of the week at camp. The rest of the week was a blur. Because this kid was such a good player, and he dominated the JV level his entire freshman year.
Okay, all right.
And by sophomore year, he was the Hudson County Player of the Year, and went on to have like 4 tremendous years in high school, and then a great career at Notre Dame, and played in the NBA, played in Europe for a very long time, has done all kinds of things, and he's actually coming back to Jersey City this summer. Lives down in Florida. He's coming back, and he's going to do some basketball clinics here.
He was the highest paid player in Europe, right?
Yes.
Europe's most successful player.
Yeah, he was Euro Player of the Year. He just did tremendous, and he has a couple of businesses here in the United States in which he employs many of his family members.
But when you're trying to instill character in the kids that are on the teams as of late, you always talk about the David Rivers stories. About having no money. And,
absolutely.
And what was it that Chris would say he would walk?
David Rivers.
Remember?
David Rivers in high school had such pride that he would never ask someone for a ride. He would never tell somebody that he didn't have the money for transportation. Many of our Saturday or Sunday morning practices when he was younger, he would run from home to practice. And when we get to the door of the gym, he would be all sweating in the middle of the winter. And it took a while for one of the other kids to tell me that the reason why he just didn't have bus money and he was running down. And then on the way home, everybody would always hop in the cars. So he didn't feel out of place hopping in the car because all the kids were in the cars. And then we said to him from that point on, David, we're going to pick you up. And then when David was a senior, we became so close that he would say to me, Coach, can you drop me off at one of my sister's houses? And he would pick one of his older sisters. And after a while, I said, Dave, how come you've been bouncing from one sister to the other at night? Did you stop and see the family? He'd say, no. He said, I have so many nieces and nephews at the house that dinner is over. My best shot at a good meal now is to go to one of my sister's houses. And he would call one of them during the day, like Marilyn or one of the sisters, and he'd let them know he's coming. And then he'd go home and for the big meal instead of going home and battling his nephews for what was left.
So I mean, we can continue this journey, but then jumping forward,
Kenny Wilson right behind him.
Now Kenny Wilson, same thing.
Kenny comes from a family of, my backcourt in 1984 was Dave Rivers and Kenny Wilson.
Which was incredible.
Villanova point guard for 3 years, Notre Dame point guard for 4 years. The poor 3 kids were in the front court, just were like running around all the time with their hands up, trying to catch passes that were coming from all different angles. But Dave was a family of 14, Kenny Wilson was a family of 11.
Right.
So you talk about 2 kids that understood what it was to become successful, and also the thing that we liked about both kids the most was all the younger kids in Jersey City who were coming up behind them. My sons, Jerry Walker,
Right.
Terry DeHare, everybody who followed them, Roderick Rhodes, everybody had met Dave Rivers or Kenny Wilson growing up. And because they had such big families, they had so many nieces and nephews,
Yep.
they knew how to treat younger kids. So if you asked any of them when they were kids, who was their favorite player, it wasn't Magic Johnson, and it wasn't Clyde Drexler, it wasn't Larry Bird. It was Dave Rivers for a long time till he went to college, and then it became Dave Rivers and Kenny Wilson, because Kenny had great personality, could really handle the ball like Dave, and they were two kids that were grounded, they were humble, but when they got on the basketball court, their personality just came out in the way they played. Just two terrific kids.
Yeah, David had the flash and the style and the greatness.
And Kenny was so quiet.
And Kenny
And
Wilson
then when get on the
was very
court,
quiet.
entirely different person.
And as far as foot speed, dribbling one end of the court, Kenny Wilson would get 6 inches
Yes.
off the floor.
Yes.
And I just recall my best friend Alan and I, we went to the game at St. Michael's High School in a bandbox that was not much bigger than this room. It was
Yep.
one of the smallest
Yep.
gyms I've ever
Yep.
been in my life.
Tile floor.
It had the tile floor.
Yep.
It was very small. It was on the end of the building,
Yes.
right?
Yep. Yep.
So I remember, if you remember that game, was I think Joe Mikewitz was there. He was still on the team. Was that right? It was Jared.
Yes.
And Kenny Wilson, right? Remember that game? He was like a jet. It was like shooting a gun.
Yes.
And the bullet just exploded up court.
Yeah, he looked like a balloon where you like he would just take off, like you'd let go of the end of the balloon and it would just take off. He's so explosive. Yeah, he was an amazing player.
But then jumping ahead a little bit, one of the greatest teams of all time has to be, Bobby's team, right? That was the next.
All of those kids grew up.
And they followed, right?
And they followed Dave in '84 and Kenny in '85 and Jasper Walker. All these kids that were coming up in St. Anthony's had all followed these two. And this team got together in 1987, which was sophomore dominated. And for the last 3 years in high school, Jerry Walker and Bobby and Terry DeHare and that whole group of kids were 91-2. And they won every national tournament and championship you could win. And they just were incredible. And we always think, and we look back on it and just say that they were fortunate enough to see really good players, but a bunch of them saw these really good players. And that motivated them all. So when it came to something about a kid not working in school or not putting enough time in playing or staying off a street corner, we would point out to Dave and Kenny, who came from huge families, and they were homebodies. When they weren't playing ball, they were home. They enjoyed being home, and I think that helped the rest of the kids because during that time, the late '80s into the '90s, the streets of Jersey City were starting to change.
Right.
And they've continued to change, and for the better. Very, very difficult now. I mean, Gary's job at the boys' club is extremely difficult now because he's battling 8 and 9-year-olds. You're battling to capture them now and keep them interested in things instead of getting involved in street life.
But I remember back when, his Bobby, who's your son, who's a kid back and growing up in Country Village at one completely the opposite end of town. And I remember the stories about how that team in particular, they were such good friends that he would team up with Jerry and he had Bobby, this little white kid, and he's playing in the courts in Booker T.
Going to the Booker T.
And then they're
Washington
going to
Projects.
Lafayette, and they're going, right, they'd go court to court.
The kids would call, and it was the '89 teams, but this started in '87 and '88. So Willie Banks, who pitched in the major leagues,
Right. Oh,
and
my God.
Jasper Walker, Mike Thomas, Sid Rayford, and Sid Rayford, Monty Davis, and then Bobby and Terry DeHare and Jerry Walker. They would all, 8 or 9 kids, would call each other, and they would manage to get, nobody had a car, everybody would manage to get to a particular place. And they would come in like gunslingers. And whoever's park it was, they would come in to play now. And then word would spread that the kids, all these young kids had come to the park, and they would play kids their age. If the older guys were there, they'd be thrilled to play against the older guys. And the tour took them everywhere. So it was almost like in Jersey City here, they had developed a reputation because they had played everywhere, and they'd go into places, and they'd go in as the enemy, perhaps.
Right on.
And after a while, the guys that just in the city, one thing we have across the city is we have respect for our sport. People, even in the craziest circumstances,
Right, I was just
have a
gonna
lot
say
of
that.
respect for a kid who's a good player. So their reputations were built at that time, not on the internet, but they were built in Audubon.